During the latter half of the 17th century, Charles II, King of England, was attending a meeting of the Royal Society, a society of natural philosophers and scientists whom he chartered in 1660. And he sat there and he listened to their accounts of experiments and inquiries and debates, and when they drew to a close, he had a question for them. Why is it that if you took a barrel, filled it to the brim with water, and inserted a live fish, the water would overflow? But, if you took that same barrel, filled it to the brim, and inserted a dead fish, the water would be untouched. Why is this the case? So, there was a lot of debate. People sat there, they speculated, they came up with theories, they came up with all kinds of reasons why a live fish and a dead fish were so different physically. It made no sense, but they pondered this intently. And finally, after the debate died down, the king had his servants bring in a large barrel. They filled it to the brim with water. They found a large, dead codfish. They inserted it into the water, and the water overflowed. Would you look at that, the king might have said. Now, tomorrow, April the 8th, is in the Eastern Asian Buddhist tradition reputedly the birthday of Siddhartha Gautama, the man who we know as the historical Buddha. If any of you want to know why I add historical to it, you can ask me later. What does Charles II, the Royal Society, and a dead fish have to do with the Buddha? Well, if you go back about 2,500 years to what is now southeastern India, the forests and the villages were alive with holy men, with yogis who wandered around from village to village teaching. One of them was the man we call the Buddha. And at one point, he came to a village of the people known as the Kalama. And the elders of the village, who were, quite frankly, like good Unitarians, they came out, they welcomed him. They thought, oh, this is great. He's come to teach us. But they had a question. And they said, basically, teachers, Brahmins, yogis all come. They come and they teach, they expound, and they glorify their own doctrines. But as for the doctrines of others, they revile and disparage them. They leave us absolutely uncertain and in doubt. Which of these venerable Brahmins and contemplatives are speaking the truth and which are lying? Well, the Buddha thought for a moment, and he replied to the Kalamas, don't go by reports, by legends, by traditions, by scripture, by logical conjecture, by inference, by analogies, by agreement through pondering views, by probability, or by the thought that this contemplative is our teacher. When you know for yourselves, when you see for yourselves, when you look and see that these doctrines work for you, not because someone has said that they work, not because Someone has debated about what the theory could possibly be behind why they should work. But if they actually work for you, then follow them, because these will be the truth. Now, what comes up for me on the eve of the Buddha's birth is what would happen if the Buddha had never been born, if Buddhism had never existed, if there were no Buddhist texts, if there were no books that mentioned Buddhism, if I wasn't here. Because it seems to me that the Dharma, the nature of reality, the teachings, is really baked into existence. It's there to be discovered and rediscovered by anyone. Each one of us has the ability to awaken. Each one of us can look at the world as it's filled with suffering, as it's filled with change, and we can see for ourselves what is going on here. And frankly, that's what would happen. If there had never been a Buddha, someday someone would sit down and go, life sucks. And they would figure out what you need to do to deal with that. And the proof of this is that people have been doing this all along, not just the Buddha, not just contemplatives. Each one of us, frankly, has seen into this particular truth of the universe. Each one of us has been able to understand what it is we need to know. We just forget. The thought comes and it flies away because, life sucks and it's filled with busyness and we move on. But if you sit down and spend some time just looking, you'll see it. You can look deeply into it yourselves. And what I wanted to do was give you an example of this. So one that also comes from New England, from Harvard, from the 19th century. It's my favorite non-Buddhist Buddhist text. If you change the names and the locations, if you change the names to the Chinese, if you change the location and the time to the Tang dynasty in ancient China, if you change the subject matter from dealing with a specimen to dealing with a koan, this story could have been republished and studied as part of a koan collection to this day. It's entitled In the Library with Agassiz by Samuel H. Scudder. Now, I looked into Scudder. He was not a Unitarian, so he can't be the subject of a UU moment. There are Scudders in New England who were Unitarian, so maybe he could be drawn in that way. I like this because of the language. It's 19th century English, and it's lovely, and it goes, "It was more than 15 years ago that I entered the laboratory of Professor Agassiz and told him that I had enrolled my name in the scientific school as a student of natural history. He asked me a few questions about my object in coming, my antecedents generally, the mode in which I afterwards proposed to use the knowledge I might acquire, and finally, whether I wished to study any particular branch. To the latter I replied that while I wished to be well-grounded in all departments of zoology, I proposed to devote myself specially to insects. When do you wish to begin, he asked. Now, I replied. This seemed to please him, and with an energetic, very well, he reached from a shelf a huge jar of specimens in yellow alcohol. "Take this fish," he said, "and look at it. We call it a hymolon. By and by, I will ask you what you have seen." With that, he left me, and in a moment returned with explicit instructions as to the care of the object entrusted to me. "No man is fit to be a naturalist," said he, "who does not know how to take care of specimens." I was to keep the fish in a tin tray and occasionally moisten the surface with alcohol from the jar, always taking care to replace the stopper right tightly. Those were not the days of ground glass stoppers and elegantly shaped exhibition jars. All the old students will recall the huge necklace glass bottles with their leaky, wax-besmeared corks half eaten by insects and begrimed with cellar dust. Entomology was a cleaner science than ichthyology. But the example of the professor who had unhesitatingly plunged to the bottom of the jar to produce the fish was infectious. And though this alcohol had a very ancient and fish-like smell, I really dared not show any aversion within these sacred precincts, and treated the alcohol as though it were pure water. Still, I was conscious of a passing feeling of disappointment, for gazing at a fish did not commend itself to an ardent entomologist. My friends at home, too, were annoyed when they discovered that no amount of eau de cologne would drown the perfume which haunted me like a shadow. In 10 minutes, I had seen all that could be seen in that fish, and started to search for the professor, who had, however, left the museum. And when I returned, after lingering over some odd animals stored in the upper apartment, my specimen was dry all over. I dashed the fluid over the fish as if to resuscitate the beast from a fainting fit, and looked with anxiety for a return of the normal sloppy appearance. This little excitement over, nothing was to be done but to return to a steadfast gaze at my mute companion. Half an hour passes. An hour. Another hour. The fish began to look loathsome. I turned it over and around, looked it in the face, ghastly. From behind, beneath, above, sideways, at 3/4 view, just as ghastly. I was in despair. At an early hour, I concluded that lunch was necessary. So with infinite relief, the fish was carefully replaced in the jar, and for an hour I was free. On my return, I learned that Professor Agassiz had been at the museum but had gone and would not return for several hours. My fellow students were too busy to be disturbed by continual conversation. Slowly, I drew forth that hideous fish, and with a feeling of desperation, again looked at it. I might not use a magnifying glass. Instruments of all kind were interdicted. My 2 hands, my 2 eyes, and the fish. It seemed a most limited field. I pushed my finger down his throat to feel how sharp the teeth were. I began to count the scales in different rows until I was convinced that was nonsense. At last, a happy thought struck me. I would draw the fish. And now, with surprise, I began to discover new features in the creature. Just then, the professor returned. "That is right," said he. "A pencil is one of the best of eyes. I'm glad to notice, too, that you keep your specimen wet and your bottle corked." With these encouraging words, he added, "Well, what is it like?" Any of you who have done a koan and confronted a teacher or been confronted by a teacher and had him go, "Well, what have you learned?" Will understand this. He listened attentively to my brief rehearsal of the structure of the parts whose names were still unknown to me. When I finished, he waited as if expecting more, and then, with an air of disappointment, "You have not looked very carefully. Why," he continued more earnestly, "you haven't even seen one of the most conspicuous features of the animal, which is plainly before your eyes as the fish itself. Look again. Look again." And he left me to my misery. I was piqued. I was mortified, still more of the wretched fish. But now I set myself to my tasks with a will, and discovered one new thing after another until I saw how just the professor's criticism had been. The afternoon passed quickly, and when, towards the end, the professor inquired, "Do you see it yet?" "No," I replied, "but I am certain I do not. I am certain I do not, but I see how little I saw before." "That is next best," he said earnestly, "but I won't hear you now. Put away the fish and go home. Perhaps you'll be ready with a better answer in the morning. I will examine you before you look at the fish." This was disconcerting. Not only must I think of my fish all night, studying, without the object before me, what this unknown but most visible feature might be, but also without reviewing my discoveries, I must give an exact account of them the next day. I had a bad memory. So I walked home by the Charles River in a distracted state with my two perplexities. The cordial greeting from the professor the next morning was reassuring. Here was a man who seemed to be quite as anxious as I that I should see for myself what he saw. "Do you perhaps mean," I asked, "that the fish has symmetrical sides with paired organs?" He was thoroughly pleased. Of course. Which repaid the wakeful hours of the previous night. After he had discoursed most happily and enthusiastically, as he always did, upon the importance of this point, I ventured to ask what I should do next. "Oh, look at your fish," he said, and left me again to my own devices. In a little more than an hour, he returned and heard my new catalog. That is good, he repeated. "But that is not all. Go on." And so for 3 long days, he placed the fish before my eyes, forbidding me to look at anything else. "Look, look, look," was his repeated injunction. This was the best entomological lesson I ever had, a lesson whose influence has extended to the details of every subsequent study, a legacy the professor has left to me. This is the essence of Zen. It's look at what is there right in front of you. It's obvious and we don't see it. But look. Thank you.